When did you meet James, and what was your first impression of him?
I met James and Joel in the late 70s, early 80s. I can't really tell you how we met. I just know he sort of appeared in my life like a like this amazing satyr that I had not known before, but I felt completely comfortable with. And we lived on the same hilltop. We were both up on Noe Hill. I had a little cottage at the top of Noe Street, and he and Joel lived around the corner. So I went to a number of parties over at their house, dinner parties, lots of pot, good food, lots of people running around in kind of peasant shirts. I had a complete set of blue floppy pirate shirts and I was really happy when I realized that that was part of James's vocabulary. I felt as if I fit in a little bit. As a former Republican, a conservative from the South, it felt like I had finally arrived at the place where I was heading.
Did he become a tale of the city?
I never wrote about James, but I certainly was inspired by him in a number of ways. First of all, he and Joel had the most beautiful relationship I'd ever seen. And the fact that there was a 30-year age gap between them was, I wouldn't say it's completely irrelevant, because I think maybe that's what made it so magic, in that there was a kind of mentor-student relationship, and yet James was able to be the boy sometimes when Joel would be the man. They had that give and take, that ability to nurture each other and care for each other that was quite beautiful. The only other example of it I knew was Christopher Isherwood and Don Bacardi. So I had two wonderful older male role models as a young man in James Broughton and Christopher Isherwood. And both of them they were different in a way, because Chris still had a lot of his upper class English moorings, even though he was quite radical politically. And James was more of a, airy-fairy free spirit. But they both did what they wanted to do, and did it with great grace and charm.
What was it like being around him?
James's chief quality was a sort of playfulness, a childishness almost in his eyes. He had this amazing body. I mean, as a man his age, he was very fit and had a quite beautiful body, and yet he had an old man's face, and buried within that were the eyes of a child, of an excited child, and there was real wonder in his being. He behaved in such a way as to make you want to find that sort of happiness, that sort of bliss. And he seemed to be saying that it's quite simple. You just let go, stop it, stop doing whatever's hurting you and worrying right now, and seize the moment, seize the joy. It was a message that a lot of people were putting out at that time, of course, in the late 60s and early 70s and well into the 70s. But James really seemed to live it. He really believed it. It really worked for him, and it attracted people to him in a very dramatic way. And I think because we were all being sexually liberated at the same time, that it helped that it was this older guy who also sang poems about, recited poems about nipples and cocks. So he was seeming to say that, your spiritual side and your sexual side are not only not conflicting with each other, they're one and the same. And that was I won't say it was a revelation, because I felt I'd sort of arrived there myself, but it was wonderful to see it sort of nailed down in such a beautiful, playful way as he did.
Can you say anything more about that effect on you, the effect of being around him on you or your work or anything like that?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty much, and I would be exaggerating beyond that.
What do you think was his influence or his contribution as an artist, as both a poet and a filmmaker?
Well, I think what James did was he wasn't afraid of being silly in any of his artistic contexts. He wasn't afraid of being silly. He let himself play and be goofy, and in doing so, he found his way to rather profound truths about what it is to be human. And I especially enjoyed his poetry. I'm not a huge fan of his films. I see their charm. But what really got to me was the poetry, because the way in which he plays with the words, and he's not just a visual guy. He's this person who knows who can be capricious and playful with words in such a way as to make you look at them in another way. There was great fun in his poetry, and people who didn't see the depth behind it really weren't looking close enough. They see the wordplay and the goofiness and the sort of shock of using words that you might not normally see in lyric poetry. But he had a way of getting at the serious by focusing on the silly, and that's very seductive because it creeps up on you.
How would you compare your writing to James?
I like to think that my own writing is similar to James's poetry in that I try not to spell out the serious issues, but let them sort of bubble up from beneath the surface, and I try to catch people off guard through humor and a certain amount of wordplay. So I felt a kind of kinship with what he was doing. I couldn't hope to whittle it down to that, the brilliance of what he did. It was very few words, and yet it would sort of hit you across the face, this is it, and that is that, and what is what, and by the time you were done with the poem, something had been said to you, and you'd felt something.
He called himself Big Joy during the last part of his life. What do you think that meant, or what's that about?
I think Big Joy is a perfect name for James, and I'm glad he seized upon it at the end of his life, because I think that was his goal at the end of his life. I didn't know him during his days in Port Townsend. I mean, I didn't have a connection with him then, but I can imagine what it was like, because he was refining things to the point that he wanted every moment to be one that was fully lived, in which he was fully conscious, and finding the joy. What is it? His tombstone says, adventure, not predicament. And that's the way he looked at his entire life. It's entirely about your perception of things, is what he seemed to be saying. If you make it about joy, if you make it about something beautiful and new, and you don't focus on the dilemma of being human, you'll find the pure beauty of being human.
Can you tell me a little more about what it was like in San Francisco in the 70s, in that atmosphere where you met him, and kind of a little bit about San Francisco and the culture in which you two were operating?
Well, it's hard for me to go back and say this is the way it was back then, because a lot of the things I was doing back then I'm still doing. For instance, I'm not going to be one of those people who says, oh, we smoked a lot of pot back in the 70s, because I still smoke pot. And I watched James smoking it as an old man, and I realized that it wasn't doing him any harm, that it was in fact making him rather charming and allowing him to live his life and be happy. It was a free, wide-open sexual environment in which people met on the street corner and could have either something rather sweet and profound in a short amount of time, or something empty and useless. I never felt that James was saying there was anything wrong with a one-night stand, for instance, but that you should, when such a thing occurs to you, when it happens, then you should see the sacred in the other person and meet on that level. And I found that myself in the baths in San Francisco. It was a real eye-opener to me to realize that you could tell the difference between a bastard and a nice guy in the dark by touch, by simple tenderness, by connecting with another human and being with them for that moment, whether you intended to go home with them even from the baths, but being with them in that moment. And I think that completely, was in sync with James's philosophy, both poetic and personal.
It's kind of a sacrament.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said that. Cokie Roberts, this is a sidebar, but I'll tell you anyway. Cokie Roberts at PBS, somebody who worked for them years ago, said she was horrified because I'd done an interview about the times. And this is what was going on. And I said, I know it sounds funny, but I feel I'm closest to God when I'm at the baths. But maybe that's just because I'm on my knees. And she was horrified. Horrified.
So how did artists and poets and filmmakers fit into that scene that you just described of San Francisco in the 70s?
We look, we observe. That's what artists do. The times were made for James and for me in a way because we were both observers, people who drew on the life around us. And if exciting things were happening, as they were, life was just that much richer and more vivid. I read the other day about the early days of Stonewall, a piece that pointed out that those drag queens that everybody talks about who were at the Stonewall Rebellion were in fact more like kind of genderfuck people, the people that you'd see, for instance, around James, who had full beards and mustaches and funny glasses and a fake wig and lipstick, and it was just a hodgepodge of gender and sexuality, all meant to kind of sabotage the notions of what it was to be a man or to be a woman. Nobody was striving for one thing or the other in a big way. And if they did, if they had a night of being hyper-masculine, they'd have another night where they'd put on the drag. And I think that was one of the things that sort of fired James's engines. He could both encourage it and participate in it. You always had the sense when you saw him, when he was putting on a goofy outfit or being silly or reading a poem about it or doing some, kind of hippy-dippy thing, that he was in it in part just for the thrill of being in it. I mean, he was having a good time. He was kicking over the traces, and it takes us our whole lives sometimes, and I think it took him his whole life to finally sort of clear out all the nonsense and just get to the pure business of being human and real. I think you'd be better.
What was significant or unique about his work, and what was groundbreaking about his work, which you've already addressed to some degree?
James was not afraid to be accessible, which is quite a quality for a poet, because some of them think they're not writing proper poetry unless it's a little obtuse. The great thing about James's poetry was that he was not afraid to be accessible. You could read it almost like a nursery rhyme. It was so simple in many of its manifestations. But he could get to the profound in that way, and he could reach the reader in a way that someone who's being more show-offy can't. And yet, if you look at many of those poems, you see how beautifully structured they are, how the sounds of them bounce off each other, and the playfulness of the juxtaposition of the words is a disciplined act. It's very clearly a disciplined act. It's not something that somebody stoned wrote on a sidewalk one night. It's the work of an ordered mind trying to say something.
Why do you think his work is not better known?
James's work, both in film and in poetry, was so off the deep end, if you will, by most American standards, that I don't think that even the poetry community could embrace him fully when he's, giggling about the joy of nipples and cocks, for instance. I think it required too much understanding, in a way, of too much evolution on the part of whatever community is trying to appreciate him. He was just way ahead of everybody else in the way in which he had just discarded most of the silly bourgeois attitudes of popular culture. And for that reason, he would always be seen as a fringe character. And I think that those people only receive their vindication in years to come when you look back and see the wisdom at the core of it. And I think that'll happen for James. I hope it will. I hope it's happening now, in the very act of making this movie.
You had mentioned when we were talking on the phone something about James and yourself a little bit as a trickster in writing. Can you talk about that?
I think I learned the word trickster from James. I think I actually heard it for the first time. I know it's kind of a Jungian archetype or something, I suppose. But in his instance, I think it had to do with knowing how to be the the sort of court jester who could bring people closer to the sublime and the profound. And he did it by, dancing around you with veils and surprising you and changing the gender at a given point. He was engaged in a kind of magic. And I had a relationship with my readers in the Chronicle, one of whom was James, of course, that enabled me to do the same kind of dance, to surprise them, to make them think that they know where they're going and then pull the rug out from them and make them look at something in an entirely different way. Make them like someone before they know what that person's really about, and then they have to like the person when they find out whatever the shocking revelation is, because they like the person himself or herself. And I've always thought of myself since that time as something of a trickster. And there are people who've written whole books on the subject, I know, but I simply see it as the ability to, conjure certain feelings out of an audience, and do it in a way that surprises your audience.
Beautiful. We wanted to talk a little bit about the film The Bed.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us, and you don't have to say positive things about this at all. Tell me about the film. What do you remember from it? What was your reaction?
Okay.
I don't want to be in James's film and tell him I don't like his movie.
Why not? Go ahead.
I didn't dislike it, but I just thought it was silly. And it was silly. I felt that James's poetry ended up saying so much more than the films did, because the early films seemed to me to be just kind of the moment in which he was just kind of busting out and saying, I can do this, so I'm going to do it. And he could say some lovely things about the diversity of life and sexuality and all of that, but some of the early films to me were just kind of tiresome. They didn't work for me in the way that they have for other people. But then again, I'm the kind of person who can be seduced by words, and when he hauled out the words, I was completely behind him. The thing about James is he was a wild and free spirit, just personally and as an artist. But he was also a gentleman. He was kind of an old-fashioned gentleman. You didn't hear him, in public at least, criticize anybody else's work. I learned that about Christopher Isherwood as well, and I've actually subsequently learned it about myself. I can privately be rather frank about what I do and don't like, but publicly I don't express that because I know how hard it is to create art, and I feel, and we have enough demons of our own, we artists, that we don't need to hear from other artists telling us that we're no good or that didn't work or whatever. And so what I had loved about James was there was a sort of generous, embracing spirit. He has very strong opinions about things, but I always saw him enfold other people, young men especially, and encourage them in a way that he must have not felt everybody was going to make it or be good, but he gave that gift of his blessing in order to make it easier for them to create.
Could you give me just kind of a stream of consciousness series of sentences that begin with James Broughton was?
Oh, Lordy.
Well, you just started with one. James Broughton was a gentleman.
Yeah.
But just kind of let yourself go.
James Broughton was a gentleman. James Broughton was a trickster. James Broughton was a self-professed crazy old man. James Broughton was horny as hell. For me, James's energy came through his eyes. What I saw in James, I saw in his eyes, and it's what brought you back for more each time. He had a wonderfully old and wrinkled face. He had an old man's face and a middle-aged man's body, a good body for a middle-aged man. But he had a wonderfully wrinkly old face and this great life and youth coming out of his eyes. If there's one aphorism from James that I think of when I think of him, is when he said something to the effect of, crazy old men are essential to society because young men need role models. And I think that's the way we saw him. Those of us who were younger and would hang out with him and Joel, we saw him as someone who was giving us permission in advance to have a certain peace and silliness in our old age. He offered you a pleasant vision of what it would be like to be 75 or however old he was when I knew him best. And to see him and Joel together was really quite beautiful because they were such a harmonious pair. I mean, they had their own interests, so that one wasn't feeding off the other. They both had their own instincts, artistic instincts, but they helped each other by being with each other. And the love they felt for each other was very, very clear. It was quite evident. And as often is the case in such a loving relationship, when you go to their house, there was a kind of synchronized quality to it, where the food would be brought out, or the joints would be brought out, or the conversation would go in a certain direction. They seemed to know where the whole evening was supposed to go, each of them providing what they had to offer. And it was a beautiful vision of a successful relationship. When I met my husband Christopher 5 years ago, I was a little less afraid of our age difference because of having known James and Joel. I also had the example of Christopher Isherwood and Don Bacardi. So the notion of an intergenerational relationship wasn't scary to me. And it made it especially beautiful when very early in our courtship, we were at the point where we were doing kind of gooey things. And he had picked up a volume of poetry to read to me on the phone. He was actually opening pages and just looking for things to read. And it was Packing Up for Paradise, James's book, a collection of poetry. And I told Chris, I knew this man, you know. And so Chris read this poem that we were both hearing for the first time called The Bliss of With. And we got shivers on opposite ends of the phone because we felt so connected to what he was saying, and it felt so applicable to our own situation. It was what we felt about each other. And so when we got married for the second time, the first time we eloped to Canada the way Joel and James did, and the second time we got married in Sausalito. I guess they did too. And I asked my friend Laura Linney, the actress, if she would come and read this poem at the wedding. So she did that on this beautiful day overlooking the harbor at Amy Tan's house over in Sausalito. And she told me afterwards that she thought it was the most beautiful poem she'd ever read. At the time, I thought she was just kind of being nice about the fact that we'd chosen it for our wedding. But she called me a couple of months later and told me that she and her fiancé, Mark, were getting married, and would I please come back to Connecticut and read James's poem at her wedding. So I did that on a pretty little mountaintop in Connecticut, and we both have framed copies of the poem. Chris and I made up a sort of artistically rendered version of the poem and gave it to Laura and Mark, and we kept one for ourselves. And we have them hanging in our separate homes as sort of a symbol of our friendship with each other, and a reminder of, the sentiment of that poem that matters to us.
Would you read the first?
This is James's poem, The Bliss of With. You have come to me out of the antiquities. We have loved one another for generations. We have loved one another for centuries. You teach me to trust the voice of my voices. You teach me to believe my own believings. You touch the palpability of my possibles. Together we reflect what our mirrors conceal. Together we upgrade the sun in our meridians. We remain open night and day to transcendence. You are incompletely disguised as a mortal. You are the eternal stranger I have always known. I saw your wings this morning. I saw your wings. When you tickle my cravings and sniff my privacies, when you douse my terror and launch my dismemberment, I salute you in the name of all that intimidates me and pray for a mild winter. But you take me apart and put me back differently. You mend my tatters and refasten my seams. You patch my pieces and tie my ends up. Then you totally unravel me. You have deranged my accounts, unbalanced my books, crossed my live wires, and torn up my agendas. I salute you in gratitude for this devastation. You are my undoing and my altogether.
Made me cry.
It's a hell of a poem.
It's a hell of a poem.
That poem is a perfect example of what James knew how to do. He creeps up on something powerful. He saved the real double whammy of that poem for the very last line. And it made me tear up when Chris read it to me for the first time, when we were both listening to it for the first time, because that is kind of what happens when you fall in love. Someone takes you apart and puts you back together. They change. They seem to change your DNA in some way that you feel rearranged in a way that makes you happy. And he uses the same. You sniff my privacies. He's always flirting with something sexual, but there's something far deeper to that than something sexual. When you fall in love with someone, they sniff your privacies. It means they've found their way to every little thing you've hidden, and make you feel safe with it.
Not just your butthole.
Not just your butthole. This is it. This is it, and I am it, and you are it, and so is that, and he is it, and she is it, and it is it, and that is that. Oh, it is this, and it is thus, and it is them, and it is us, and it is now, and here it is, and here we are, and this is it. The air of the parson. I don't like his looks, and he don't like me, but I'm a cowboy now, and so is he. So I'm going to get my gun and go shoot Jesus. I'm going to shoot Jesus before he shoots me. Pop says it's something you mustn't ever do, that you can't shoot Jesus because he's in heaven, and you won't go to heaven until you die, and you don't ever die till the right time to. But I'm a good cowboy. I'll be tougher than he, and we'll fight this matter out for all to see. I'm going to get my gun and go shoot Jesus. I'm going to stop Jesus before he stops me.